Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to A&D's quarterly webinar, Making Digital Accessibility Part of Your DNA. My name is Emily Sparling and I am the Member Experience Team Leader here at A&D, and it is my absolute pleasure to be opening today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have everyone online this afternoon. We have what you would call a virtual full house. This has been a popular webinar and we have over 300 people joining in via the webinar and the audio system today, and I know and trust that you will all enjoy the session immensely. Before I hand over to our presenters this afternoon, I wanted to run through a few quick points. As a reminder, for access to the webinar slides, you do need to log on to the online portal using the link that was emailed to you, and audio access is via the phone line only today. There is a chat function, as I can see lots of you are already using. Particularly interesting to me is the chat about the chocolate. Please feel free to use that chat function to talk to each other through the session as the presentation goes along. In terms of questions, you are very welcome to use and ask questions either via the chat function or the phone today, whatever is your preference. But I will ask if we could hold questions to the end just so that we can manage those and we can get through our presentation. But there will be time at the end for questions, so please keep a note of what you'd like to ask our wonderful facilitators. As another point, we do have a captioner on the line, so when you do ask questions, please introduce yourself. And if only one person could speak at a time, that would be appreciated. I know it's hard when we're on a webinar and teleconference, but if we've got a few people wanting to ask a question, I'll sort of state the first name I hear, and then we can go with that question to begin with. For information, and I've seen a couple of questions about this on the chat already, the webinar is being recorded and the slides will be provided following today's session. Everyone will receive an email early next week thanking you for your attendance and also providing you with the information. At the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a short survey. We would love to hear your feedback, so please stay on the line to complete this feedback survey. It is quick, and as I said, it will help us to provide you with future webinars. And lastly, if you could, when we begin the webinar, mute your phone to limit the background noise and any distractions from your office. Obviously, should you wish to ask questions, please unmute, but just whilst we're facilitating the webinar, if you could please mute your phone, that would be wonderful. Now, without further delay, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our presenters for this afternoon, Sarah and Andrew from Intopia. Sarah and Andrew work for Intopia, a digital accessibility consultancy creating an inclusive digital world. A bit about Andrew. Andrew is a principal consultant with Intopia and has been working in the field of digital accessibility for over 20 years. During this time, he established the Digital Access team at Vision Australia, worked on ageing and disability at W3C in Europe, and as the Senior Accessibility and Inclusion Expert at the Digital Transformation Agency and AGIMO. Wow. Welcome, Andrew. And Sarah is Director and Co-founder at Intopia and says she can't compete with Andrew's years of experience, and in Sarah's words, 9 years isn't bad though, right? Sarah worked with Media Access Australia and PwC before starting Intopia over 3 years ago. She's also founder of A11Y Bites and A11Y Camp, which have grown to be Australia's largest events on digital accessibility and inclusion. So thank you so much for being here today, Sarah and Andrew, and imparting your wisdom. Over to you.
All right, fantastic. So thank you so much for inviting us. I'm blown away by the response to the webinar. Very quickly on our first slide, if you want to catch either Andrew or myself on Twitter, you can catch Andrew at Amja, A-M-J-A, myself, Sarah, TP, and our company Intopia at Intopia. So today's presentation draws on the strategic work that we have done with organisations to make them more inclusive and accessible. In particular, we sort of focus on looking beyond technical standards to focus on incremental steps to create more enjoyable, effective digital experiences for everyone.
So just to set the scene, we thought we should describe to you what we mean when we say accessibility. Typically, a lot of people think of people with permanent disability when it comes to accessibility, but accessibility addresses the needs of a much wider audience than just people who have an ongoing disability. It includes people who might have broken their arm, people working in a noisy environment, using a mobile phone outdoors, other temporary impairments. And I read a report some years ago that indicated that about 13% of the population experiences a temporary impairment at any point in time due to illness or accident, and other situational disabilities. We find it important for organisations to establish what accessible means to their organisation as part of building a business case around it, particularly if you're having trouble convincing senior executives why accessibility is important. In many cases, taking an even broader view of inclusion that includes culture and linguistic diversity, a range of technical proficiencies and access to technology, literacy and numeracy, and a range of other factors creates an even stronger business case. And published an article late last year talking about the business case and building on the business case that the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C published or revised late last year. So today we'll be talking about getting better, creating a better experience through, we're going to talk about standards and best practice, we're going to talk about user research and testing, an important aspect. What we want to do is talk also about what we call shift left, which is shifting accessibility earlier in the process, and also the consideration of accessibility in the procurement process. And then we're going to draw this together at the end in terms of how to plan for better experiences. We know we're covering a lot today, so we have a list of resources and the slides will be shared. So we have a list of resources at the end of the presentation to help you explore some of these topics further after the event.
Andrew, sorry, can I interrupt? It's Emily from A&D. Can I just remind everyone to have their phone on mute? We're just getting a bit of background noise. That would be fantastic. Sorry to interrupt, Andrew.
Emily, are we coming through clearly enough at the moment?
Absolutely, loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. So when it comes to digital, it's more than just your public website, which is where a lot of people's thinking starts and stops. You also need to consider internal systems for your staff. That's particularly important. So we sort of define digital as including, obviously, the public websites, web applications and services, mobile apps, and the whole world is sort of moving partly away from websites to mobile apps so you can do things on the go much more easily. Intranets, HR, finance, and other internal applications that end up going through a web interface, digital content and documents, including emails, and we find a lot of emails are sent out that are not terribly accessible. And the final one that we would always include is kiosks, and kiosks might include tablets that may be available in store for accessing your organisation's information and services.
So let's start by talking about standards and best practice. So often accessibility is synonymous with WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I wanted to give a brief introduction to WCAG, just in case there's anyone on the line who might not have come across it. So WCAG is a standard in itself, plus a suite of documents that describe how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities. Back in 1999, WCAG 1 was released. We then had WCAG 2.0 released in 2008. And then 10 long years later, we had WCAG 2.1 released, and that was in June last year. And I think everyone in accessibility chucked a party to have a point release after 10 years. Now, that point release particularly addresses requirements for people with low vision, mobile devices. So WCAG 2.0 was actually released the same year as the iPhone, so we really weren't thinking about mobile devices, small screens, touch screens, that kind of thing when WCAG 2.0 was written and released, and also cognitive impairment and neurodiversity, although to be honest I think not a lot of those criteria made it into 2.1, but we hope to see more criteria make it into future updates. When we're talking about WCAG, we actually have 3 levels, level A, AA and AAA. Each of these levels build on each other. Most sort of policies or recommendations you'll see recommend level AA as an equivalent, so that means we're meeting all of the criteria for level A and AA. Now, at the moment, a lot of our current policies recommend WCAG 2.0. But we actually know that organisations like the Australian Human Rights Commission and also Australian Government and others are moving to recommend 2.1. So we really encourage you to actually be making that step towards 2.1. It's actually not very hard. It was just a point update, so it means that it's just a little bit extra to do. And to be honest, if you're doing good responsive design and sort of mobile, you're probably ticking off some of those criteria anyway. Some of the clients we work with are already moving to 2.1 as the benchmark as well, and they're progressively implementing that for any new websites or applications. Now, a bit of a heads up, based on our work with the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, we do expect there probably to be another point update, so a 2.2 in another year or so, particularly hopefully providing more of those requirements around cognition and neurodiversity. So it's definitely a watch this space. It's a great thing to have more updates because it means there's incremental updates as opposed to a big bang approach. Just a reminder, if everyone could make sure that you're on mute, we're hearing a little bit of background noise. So, thank you. So when someone says, you know, do you conform with WCAG 2, whether that's 2.0 or 2.1, really what they're asking is, first of all, do you meet the requirements for your chosen level of conformance? Usually that's AA. Does your website or application work with commonly used assistive technologies such as screen readers, screen magnifiers or voice recognition software, and adaptive strategies as well, such as turning on high contrast or changing font style, size, that kind of thing? And lastly, you want to make sure that that also conformance means any end-to-end process or task that a user might need to complete also meets those requirements. Now, it's actually the second point around commonly used assistive technologies that I wanted to draw attention to, because in our experience we find that there's often a very big focus on meeting the requirements but not checking that something works as expected with assistive technologies. It's important particularly to do this for things like complex applications. If you've got any sites with custom controls, or if you're using or overusing ARIA, so ARIA being accessible rich internet applications, it's a specification that's great. It really helps to make experiences more accessible for screen reader users, but it can have some support issues. And it's also important if you're using like frameworks or single page apps.
So when we're reviewing existing products, we want to make sure that we are taking a representative sample of pages or views. And as Sarah just mentioned, we want to make sure that we're looking at key user journeys for testing when we're doing those tests. We want to test the website against, or the sample of the website against WCAG, and we've actually got some references in the closing slides to get you started with that. And then we need to fix issues, prioritising those issues based on what might be user impact. So when you're doing this sort of thing, you can do the conformance testing yourself if you have enough expertise in-house, and a lot of organisations do these days. It's really pleasing to see how many organisations have somebody who has accessibility as part of their job title these days. It's a refreshing change from about 10 years ago in particular. If you don't have that expertise, you can, as I said, you can still do some limited or easy checking. enough to get you started and find out what some of the key problems might be that you might be able to address initially before you engage a qualified consultant, possibly to do the testing and explain the outcomes. If you do employ a qualified accountant, yes, we all should employ qualified accountants for our tax, but if you're employing a qualified consultant around accessibility, one of the things that you want to look for is that they're going to give some knowledge transfer back to your organisation. You don't want them to come in and write a report and leave again. You want to make sure that you're actually going to learn from any report that they or review that they might undertake. One of the issues that we regularly come across is what do we do with old material? And there's going to be times when you need to draw a line in the sand on these old systems and old documents. Sometimes you may want to prioritise key areas and tasks, or the documents that are most commonly accessed, or what those key processes or tasks are that you're expecting your clients or customers to view, and prioritise working on those. At other times you might say, okay, we're going to do the minimum now because we're going to be doing a major overhaul next year. And so at that point you draw a line in the sand, okay, and say everything from now on is going to be accessible, and we're only going to address the old things if somebody raises an issue with us. And talking of raising an issue, you really should have a clear process for people to contact you, and then a clear process internally to address their needs on a case-by-case basis. Anecdotally, we hear that the complaints that end up at the Human Rights Commission are because, by and large, people are ignored or overlooked, or takes 3, 6, 9 months before an organisation gets back to them, and that's just totally unacceptable in terms of customer service.
I know we're leaving questions to the end, but just to clarify, key user journeys are really just key tasks that someone needs to complete on a website or app. So if you're buying something, that might be being able to log in, being able to add something to your cart, being able to check out and complete that checkout process.
So moving on to what might be creating a new product or totally overhauling an existing product or website. One of the things that we want to do is address accessibility requirements at the right point in the product life cycle. And a phrase that's commonly used here is that accessibility is everyone's responsibility, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about shifting accessibility to earlier in the process or shifting left. So it's important to recognise that WCAG is only a set of requirements. It's a good technical standard to be working towards, and informs an essential baseline for a usable digital product, but to make it fully usable, you need to go beyond those technical requirements. Drawing an analogy from the user experience world, a heuristic review is a technique where you assess a product or a user journey based on a set of heuristics. However, UX practitioners don't solely rely on those heuristics to create a usable product. They go out and talk to users, undertake usability testing, and a whole range of other techniques that they employ. In the same way, we should not rely solely on WCAG to create a usable product. So just 4 quick tips here. One is, and I think I probably alluded to this, don't let perfection get in the way of a better product. We should be working on this incrementally. Small improvements are better than throwing your hands in the air and saying, okay, in 5 years' time we'll have a perfect experience for everybody. By that time they may have gone somewhere else.
Remember that WCAG is just one tool in your user experience toolkit, not your only tool. And when it comes to frameworks, and this is more technical sort of point to our recommendation, don't trust every accessibility claim. Often you'll find that a framework sort of claims to be accessible, but as the people on the other side of the fence that are often then coming into organisations, working with organisations who have, accepted a framework as being accessible, and then we come in and we actually find it's not the case. So unfortunately, you do have to do a bit of due diligence there before you, ideally before you start developing your product. And lastly, don't try to over-engineer accessibility. I often work with people that are sort of, fairly new to accessibility, and they're absolutely trying to do the right thing, but they often over-engineer the experience. And I have a statement that I like to use, which is killing the screen reader user with kindness, where often, there's lots of additional information that's been added just for screen readers that is often unnecessary, and so it just adds to sort of noise and cognitive load. So it's important to sort of really focus on that experience and what's needed, and not try to over-engineer things.
Okay, so talking about user research and testing, which is going beyond the technical requirements of WCAG. First of all, know your user. So user research and usability testing helps you learn about user behaviours, user needs, user motivations, and can help you understand the different types of technologies that different people might be using, the different levels and the different ways that they use that technology. As Sarah said, a lot of developers try and kill people with kindness, to put it bluntly. And one of the things that we often find is that it can take quite a while for people using assistive technology to catch up with what the latest development tools or the development techniques that are quite legitimate might be. And so, a lot of developers go overboard, and they also tend to drop off the practices that would make it more accessible for existing users. One of the things that we find is that as we move just beyond the technical accessibility and we move to build an inclusive design or an inclusive experience that and bring the user into how we're trying to build and develop and understand their needs and how they're operating, we actually move from a low level of usability where we're just meeting technical accessibility to a much higher level of usability where we're considering a much broader inclusive design experience for people.
So to pick up on that inclusive design point, we're going to talk a bit about research and testing today, but also think about ways that you can involve users in, say, co-design processes. So if you're designing a brand new product, first of all, think about doing some research into the current pain points, even if yours is a new product, the current pain points with existing products. And also then how you can actively have users involved with the design process as well. I've had the experience of doing this where I could actually work with, say, in this case it was a person that was blind, and we actually would walk through interfaces before they were even built just to get some feedback on how the interface was structured and what they might expect to hear, possible, label changes and that kind of thing. And that's a process that you can do actually at that design phase. So you don't have to wait to the end in order to be able to test the product. You can get that early feedback. You can be testing with, say, low vision users, people with dyslexia, before you've even written your first line of code. So when we talk about user recruitment for, say, research and testing, we've got a few things that we'd like you to keep in mind. First is technical proficiency. When you've got users particularly using assistive technologies, their technical proficiency can really play a difference in sort of the results that you're getting. So someone with high technical proficiency probably can work around sort of issues and be able to complete tasks even though there might be issues in their way. Someone with less technical proficiency will actually, it will be a much bigger blocker for them and actually may stop them from completing a process. So if you're doing user recruitment, try to get a range of different technical proficiencies. Also focus on different software and hardware usages. So PC versus mobile is a very different experience for people, including those using different technologies. Congenital versus acquired disability. So someone with a congenital disability or someone who's had it since birth can often approach the sort of technical experience a lot different to someone with, say, an acquired disability, where they might be newer to their technology. Again, this might affect their technical proficiency as well. And age is a big one. So there is definitely, sort of age-related impairments that come along, sort of low vision, hearing starts to go, someone might have arthritis. But people's tolerance for errors as they get older can often mean that, it's harder for them to complete the experience as well. So definitely make sure to get a broad age range in this too. Also, a lot of organisations start by maybe, putting a call out to staff to say, hey, can you test this product? Now, in the first instance, that might be good to get initial feedback, but do remember that your staff often know your product, particularly if this is an external-facing website. So it's not always a representative sample to sort of pull from your staff pool for usability research and testing. Now, in terms of the actual session itself, some of the things we would recommend are allowing more time for usability sessions with people with disabilities. Usually we work on a ratio of, if you would normally spend an hour for a usability session, add an extra half an hour on top of that. People could just be, sometimes it takes longer for tasks to be completed, and you also want to maybe work in breaks there for anyone who might need them. Also allow users to bring their own device if possible. Users often have, very specific setups. They're used to their own keyboard. They're used to their own technology. So that will give you the best experience if you can allow a person to bring their own device. There can be, setup issues, and also, it will depend whether the product that you're reviewing is externally accessible. So I know this is not always possible, but it definitely gives the best experience for the user. Think about having an assistive technology or an accessibility specialist at the session. That can just help you if you get into trouble, particularly if you are asking users to use your device, where you might actually need someone to go in and be changing settings or moving a user past something that's a problem. Consider testing or even doing research in their environment, such as at home if they're comfortable versus your office. That can give you a better idea of their own technical setup, and sometimes people have different setups at home versus what they use on the go. Consider how users will get to your session. So is transportation easy? And also pay users for their time and also their travel. Think about the payment method. Gift vouchers, not the best if there's codes on the back of a gift voucher that someone has to, read in order to access that gift voucher. So just have a think about how accessible your payment methods are if they're not sort of just straight bank payments.
Okay, so just quickly our top tips here. First of all, noting that one user with a particular disability using a particular set of technologies isn't representative of all users. That said, they can give you a lot of insights into the usability of your product and things that might be improved. Understanding the difference between, as Sarah alluded to, user proficiency versus product failure, and the levels of people's different levels of technical proficiency, can impact on whether there's a product failure or it's user failure, for want of a better word. Known usability issues are often more of a problem for people with disabilities. Those of us who can see the screen, hear the output, clearly use a keyboard and mouse, all have, might just ignore a minor usability issue, but for a lot of people with disabilities, those usability issues can become much more serious. And finally, include people with disability in your regular cadence in terms of all your user research, all your usability. We've got some organisations now who are doing usability testing on their products on a monthly basis, and they've one company in particular, and probably soon two that we're working with, making sure that 2 out of 10 people that they bring in have a disability and a variety of different disabilities each month. So moving on, shift left accessibility, where we want to move accessibility earlier in the design and development process. Traditionally, accessibility has been considered the responsibility of the developer, and testing for accessibility has been right at the end after a product has been developed and is about to be released, sometimes next week or next month. And at that stage, it's far too late to fix up any of the issues. There's a lot more recognition now that accessibility must be integrated right from the start of the design and build process, and you know, the move to agile development environments has actually helped to encourage this, which is terrific to see. The cost of fixing issues increases significantly during the project lifestyle. If we can address accessibility and usability at the concept stage, at the wireframe, at the design, they're fairly quick to move to remedy before we start getting into implementation. Once we've left some of these things to implementation, then the cost goes up even further. If we leave them to the very end of the process, as was done traditionally at staging and then into production, trying to fix issues after we've released a product live can have significantly higher costs again. I've seen estimates from different organisations of 30 times and even greater than that of addressing an issue after a product has gone live versus addressing it right back at the early design and early development stage. So what we're talking about when we say shift left is moving the model of when we're considering accessibility right back to the early design, the planning and design stage, and during the earlier development and build, and not leaving it as traditionally was to test and deployment and release.
So in that traditional view, usually testing is done after that, the design and build and before launch. But the way we want to see it is actually accessibility should be throughout the entire process. So there's certain things at that design process that we should be paying attention to, things like colour and contrast, defining requirements like how big your touch target areas are, so when you click on a button, you know, how big that area should be, what the flow of information is on the screen. All of that can actually be done at the design point. We've also listed content design there because we feel it's important to also be using real content as you go through this process. Testing is not just about testing the interaction, but actually testing the content and the understandability of that content. So it should not only be factored into the creation of the content, but also when you're doing usability testing, making sure you're actually testing that as well. In the same way, at that build stage, then developers have particular responsibilities for accessibility as well. And then you'll notice that that QA stage actually becomes a lot smaller, that testing stage. Really, that QA for me is just a gate. It's a gate to make sure that nothing has slipped through the cracks. I've been involved with projects where, you know, we have been embedded into teams as accessibility subject matter experts and actually provided this advice for design and build. You will have the odd issues still pop up in QA, but by and large it's a very small amount, and because you've actually designed things to be accessible, then you're getting not just a more robust experience, but actually a better experience as well. And any of those issues you find will hopefully be minor when you test at the end, and you know, you can't change things at that point in time, particularly with the visual design. Often that means a compromised experience. We also have accessibility in that launch phase, and that's particularly around, for instance, if you're updating content. So if you've got news content that goes live, you also want to make sure your content stays accessible. Now, for the techies in the room, you know, if you've got your agile process, make sure that accessibility is part of your acceptance criteria and also your definition of done for each sprint. So there's some great resources that we've included at the end of this slide that actually talk about the different roles and responsibilities for people. This is a screenshot of one from the University of Melbourne that actually talks through at a high level the different sort of requirements for project managers, so making sure your project is set up for success, that if your team doesn't have the accessibility capability needed, that you actually make sure that you're either upskilling them or bringing in someone that can provide that experience, through to your visual designers, UX and interaction designers, developers, and then your content editors. So our top tips for this, accessibility is really everyone's responsibility. By shifting left, we get a lot better experience and also cost savings as well. You do need to ensure everyone have the skills required to include accessibility in their everyday work. So make sure that you think about whether you need a training program perhaps internally for staff, and also that over time as staff leave the organisation, that accessibility is part of your job descriptions, but also know that not everyone is going to come to you with the accessibility skills needed, so you will need to have a program of work around that. And include content early in the process, as we foreshadowed.
So as we mentioned right at the start, accessible procurement is part of the key to ensuring that accessibility is part of your DNA. One of the things that you need to do is tell your suppliers that you want accessibility, making sure that it's clear in your requests for proposal, your requests for quotation. Tell them what standard you expect them to meet. Is it WCAG 2.1 AA, or are you still working with WCAG 2? Are you expecting some other standard? Those of you who are working internationally might be working with the US Section 508. Give them some specifics and tell them that you expect people to be able to use the product, for instance, without a mouse. Some very specific things like that can help establish for them what you actually mean when you give them a standard to meet. If they don't meet it, ask them how they might plan to meet it in the future. That's a very key thing when you come to assess some of the aspects, and ask questions that might allow you to assess their capability. Importance of once it's locked into systems that are inaccessible, then once your organisation is locked into systems that are inaccessible, it's really hard to move forward, and it has a huge impact on staff with disabilities as well. So it's not just the any product that you might be looking at for an external perspective, but also for staff use. Two problems we commonly encounter is that procurement is not part of the specification to suppliers, though that's changing slightly over time. And when included in procurement, companies are responding just by saying, yes, we can do that, often not deliver in reality is our experience. So one of the things you can easily do to, as a quick check on their capability, have a look at their own website. Is it accessible? It's not necessarily a failure, but it allows you to ask them, why have they got particularly low contrast on one part of their website, for instance, and what do they really understand about accessibility requirements?
So we've talked a lot about the WCAG standard, but there's actually a procurement standard called EN 301549 that is specifically around accessible ICT procurement. There's actually two versions of this standard. There's a 2015 version, and this is the version that is currently adopted by Standards Australia. So its designation is ASEN 301549, and it's called the Accessibility Requirements Suitable for Public Procurement of ICT Products and Services. Now, this particular standard aligns with WCAG 2.0 at the moment. We also have a 2018 version, Accessibility Requirements for ICT Products and Services, and that one actually aligns with WCAG 2.1. So even though the 2015 version is the one that's been adopted by Standards Australia, there's no reason why you can't actually be asking organisations to meet that 2018 version. So that's a really good thing. We know of, for instance, through our work with the Digital Transformation Agency procurement team, we know that they're actively implementing ASEN 301549. They've started with their hardware panel refresh and including the requirements for hardware, and then we'll soon be moving on to their software panel. We also know of other organisations requiring either this procurement standard or WCAG 2.0 or 2.1, and in some cases people are actually going down to the level of actually even requiring usability testing, so saying you must do usability testing with a certain amount of users. Now, the requirement actually covers not just software, it covers ICT with two-way communication, video capability, hardware, web, non-web documents, software, documents and support services, and also relay and emergency service access. So it actually covers more than just WCAG in terms of web content. So top tips, make sure procurement is in your policies, your call for proposals and your contracts. Have a clear process for assessing a vendor's capability, and then ensuring the accessibility of the product is maintained over time, or that there is a clear action plan if that product is not completely accessible when you do buy it. So, wrapping up, planning for better. I'm just going to note that because we got started late, we're going to wrap up soon once we get through this section and then take questions. So for those of you who can stay on, please feel free to stay on. And for those that can't, this will obviously be captured as part of the recording and the slides will be shared as well. So when we talk about an accessibility program, the first thing is organisations making a commitment to accessibility. And I actually have to give a shout out to Donna Purcell, who is on the A&D board, for a beautiful analogy where she said to me that, you know, organisational commitment to accessibility can be a little bit like buying a gym membership. You buy that gym membership, but it's a whole different thing to actually use that gym membership. So it's a really good thing to do, but all the other things that need to come after to actually improve your accessibility also need to be in place.
So some of the things that we would recommend in addition to a formal organisational commitment is setting up an accessibility steering committee that can sort of oversight the work across the organisation, across all the digital assets, internal and external. Create a network of champions. These people don't need to be accessibility experts, but they're the people that are promoting the cause, if you like, across the whole organisation. Probably, you know, you want champions in different business areas. You want some champions at a higher level in management. You also want some champions down at the work of the technical development level as well. So you can getting that breadth of experience across that championship network. Create a plan to make old and new products accessible. It's all very well to make a commitment, but if you don't have a plan to carry out that commitment, probably nothing much is going to get done except the few people who are already doing that. Ensure that accessibility is included in your ways of working, and that means, you know, in all the discussions and all the planning that you might be doing for across the board for digital delivery. And then finally, making training available to those who need it. We can find that, you know, with continual staff turnover these days, increasing staff turnover, as people come and go, some people, you know, they've all got the same level of, from a developer or a development team perspective, they've all got the same level of design experience or development experience, but they often don't understand accessibility to the extent that they need to ensure that you can meet your commitment. So making sure that you actually provide that training to lift their skills is an important part.
So our top tips, first one is to ensure a good communications and change management plan. Actually, the most important thing is often not the technical side of accessibility, it's the strategic side of accessibility, and that needs a good communication and change management plan that is ongoing. Programs often fail if they don't have these in place.
Part of that good communication plan is ensuring that senior executives talk about accessibility and the need for accessibility and inclusion within the organisation, because that establishes that, that commitment right from the top of the organisation.
Focus on progressive small wins and communicate those broadly as well. We often get so caught up in the grind that we don't actually celebrate wins and actually show those, you know, that momentum, and that momentum can sort of build on itself. Also make sure that awareness is a continuous process. We sort of mentioned about staff turnover. We've often seen organisations that have been doing really well, and then some key people leave, and because there's not sort of processes and plans in place for that, and continuous awareness and capability building, then they sort of fall off the wagon a bit. So that just makes sure that the good work that you've sort of invested in continues.
And as Sarah mentioned earlier, a policy or process is only as good as its usage. Going back to that gym analogy, you've got the gym membership, but if you don't actually turn up to the gym, then it might make you feel good, but that's about all it does. And a policy or processes that you might have written for your organisation are much the same. Okay, so let's continue the conversation. We do have some questions that have come in and have been compiled by the A&D staff here. So let's have a look at those. First question from Donna. Can you share some examples or screenshots of an over-engineered website?
We'll take it on notice.
Yes. Screenshots, probably no. It tends to be more over-coded behind the scenes, particularly Killing with Kindness, a screen reader user, where they get told certain aspects of a screen 17 different ways and continually as they're moving through the screen, even though it's obvious that they're moving from the the banner at the top into the menu area. There's lots of code that gets added because people think it's a good thing to make it clearer, but sometimes this can, as we've said, can be over-engineering.
So question from Maxim, 98% of websites in 2012 didn't meet WCAG 2 standards. How do we enforce the Disability Discrimination Act legislation around this? You give us the tricky ones. Okay, so maybe just a little bit of context for people. So Disability Discrimination Act sort of makes sure that people aren't discriminated against based on their disability. If someone feels like they're being discriminated against, they can make a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission, which goes to mediation, and then if that isn't satisfactory, then the person can take an organisation to court. I think the first thing I'll say is based on sort of what we've talked about today, that WCAG is not the be-all and end-all, when I see stats, and look, I'm absolutely not taking away from the fact there are so many websites that are not accessible, but when I see stats that just measure WCAG conformance and we're not looking at the extent of the issues. So is this that there are 10 issues on a website or are there 100 issues on the website? So I think we need, first of all, better metrics to measure this. In terms of enforcing the Disability Discrimination Act, I personally think that the stick in Australia, i.e. the legislation, isn't the best way to do this. It's different in the US at the moment. There's thousands of cases happening in the US at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily lead to organisational change. It can lead to a website being fixed. It can lead to technical accessibility, but it actually doesn't lead to change. So I feel that having these discussions, and I guess Andrew's seen more so than I, but I have seen accessibility mature significantly in the last sort of 9 years that I've been part of this, and I think we are on the right track. I do think, though, there's still more to be done.
Okay, we are slightly over time already, and the plan was to finish at 1 o'clock. We do apologise for the technical glitches early on. I'm sure A&D will be looking into that to make sure it doesn't get repeated. But thank you very much for contacting us. We know that some people have to leave now, so thank you for joining us. We will continue with a few more questions, but thank you to those who have to go move, only had the hour put aside. Okay, so any tips from Marie, any tips on how to tap into diverse users for co-designing? This is a difficult question. If you talk to people with disabilities, they always say, I'm here, why doesn't somebody come and talk to me? But it's the connection that is the problem, and we find that a lot of organisations go through commercial providers for their user research and usability, and most of those organisations have no one with a disability on their panels. They've got tens of thousands of people on their panels, but very, very few or no people with disabilities. I've worked with a government organisation once who went through one of these commercial panels and asked for people with vision impairment, and 5 people turned up with reading glasses. That was the best that they were able to do for them. Not exactly what the government agency was looking for. We have recognised that there is a gap in the market here, and if you were to go to our website, one of the services that we offer is Intopia Connect, where we can actually help you connect with people with disability for that type of research. So do have a look at our website afterwards and you should be able to find that service. We're at the early stages. We don't have a lot of people on our panel yet, but we're actively growing that panel at the moment for exactly this reason. Nitzan, what is the best, oh sorry, we've just done that one. Linda, the screen's a little bit away from me. Linda, is there some way to get someone to help us understand WCAG 2.1? Yes, in fact, what we will do is make sure that we include a couple more references when A&D distribute the slides afterwards, because there are some very good blog posts out there. Other organisations like ourselves in Australia can come and give you an introduction or an in-depth overview or understanding of what those requirements are. There are other organisations apart from ourselves, but we'd be more than happy to come and talk to you.
If there is anyone in government in Canberra on the line, we're actually running a WCAG 2.1 session in Canberra, which is through the Digital Transformation Agency, that on the 17th of May, so you can also join that, and that's the type of session that we can come in and do for your organisation as well. So Tara asks, do you have any recommendations for setting up a test suite of assistive technologies? Absolutely. So I actually think the step before maybe setting up a test suite is actually to set up a what your baseline is for accessibility testing. So at an organisational level, we've helped a lot of organisations sort of actually create a list of what assistive technologies they're going to test with to make sure that their website or product works as expected. So I actually think that's probably the first step in your process. That can include different assistive technology and web browser combinations. It can include, you know, for instance, keyboard testing and that kind of thing. And that actually then creates that baseline that you can use across your organisation. There's different ways of doing that as well. So some organisations I've worked with, we've actually taken a tiered approach, just recognising that sometimes the effort required to test with, you know, multiple assistive technologies can you know, add a lot of time to the testing process. So we've taken a staged approach where for critical tasks or critical pages, we have a broader sort of test suite, and then for other pages, we have a slightly more reduced test suite for assistive technologies. So that's probably where I'd recommend you starting. Then there's, of course, the buying of the licenses depending on which assistive technologies you're using. One tip, particularly if you're in an organisation that can support this, JAWS, which is sort of still the predominant screen reader on PC, has a JAWS server license. What that means is you can buy a server license with, say, 5 licenses, and then anyone in your organisation can use it as long as there's only 5 people using it at any point in time. So JAWS being a fairly expensive product, that can actually be easier when someone's not relying on it, you know, day to day, but just using that for testing.
Just a word of caution on setting up a test suite of AT, that it's a very good starting point, but it is not the same when you know your product and you know what's on the screen because you can see it, to run through it with some of these assistive technologies. It's a very good starting point to check for issues, but it doesn't substitute for getting some real people who rely on that technology to come in and do some testing for you.
So Moira, based on our user needs, we have been publishing updated guidance in track changes and a clean version. Microsoft Office implies that a screen reader can navigate through track changes if in markup mode. My question is, does your organisation consider a track change document accessible? Yeah, Andrew's in the background saying technically yes. So yes, if you have the latest screen readers and you do things in a particular way, then track changes should be able to be read. However, I've actually worked with people who use a screen reader where their screen reader or even their Braille device is not able to support track changes. This is sort of the difference between, I guess, technical accessibility versus the practicalities of sometimes what happens. I would recommend that I guess I'm not sure where this question is, if it's a single person in an organisation that might be having trouble, but I think you work with individuals on what is the best way for them to be able to consume information and track changes. If you're getting the feedback that there are users with older, screen readers and that, or that there are users with older screen readers, then yes, you might need to look at a different way of marking up that document to make sure that the information is inclusive for all.
We've had a related question about understanding WCAG 2.1. Do we have any recommendations for the best training programs available for WCAG 2.1? I think all the organisations in Australia, ours included, but I can't speak specifically for the others, all the training that we're running now, as we've been monitoring WCAG 2.1 even before it became a technical recommendation at the W3C, we've been building in aspects of WCAG 2.1. All the training that Intopia runs now includes WCAG 2.1. So, yep, we can certainly help you with training. Again, if you go to our website, an overview of our training is provided, but please contact us for detail and any specific requirements. Another question, what are some of the issues associated with email? Yeah, that's a very good question. Often we find that we get a whole lot of stuff embedded as images in email. That's a very, very common problem because it's been designed to look pretty. We often find that there's no structure to an email, so it's hard to work your way through those emails. So they're probably two of the most common things that we see with emails. Personal emails aren't a problem. They tend to be read from top to the bottom. And there's no problem there, but it's the emails that come out of generated by the commercial programs that we're trying to email all your customers. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there are some technical limitations sometimes of particularly e-newsletters, so ones created through Campaign Monitor and MailChimp and that kind of thing. So often, it's how we're creating those emails in order to make sure that they're accessible, and also some of the technical constraints. So we do find that people put in images because perhaps the email clients aren't supporting text that's styled with CSS, but there are definite ways around that. So it's sort of about really looking at that experience. Now, the last question, the story behind the name Intopia. So we actually came up with our name. It's a combination of inclusive utopia. So we sort of, when we set up Intopia 3 odd years ago, what we really wanted to do was partner with organisations and actually almost go down the rabbit hole to, and be on that journey to creating an inclusive utopia, and that's how the name Intopia came about. Yeah, I'm really happy to say we've done this. We work with a lot of people possibly on the line, I would say, a lot of AND members and also large organisations outside of that on their accessibility, and not just doing WCAG reviews, that kind of thing, but actually working to how we establish accessibility as business as usual, and all the pieces that sort of go into that. So that brings us to the end of the questions, at least the ones we've been given. We did offer, if there's any more questions that come through, we're more than happy to provide written responses for them. So I'm going to hand back to Emily in Sydney.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah and Andrew. I think we can all agree, and certainly the chat function is agreeing with me that everyone has found it an incredibly useful and informative session, and I thank you from all of our participants and also A&D for your generosity in sharing your thoughts and your comments today. So thank you, and also for staying on the line a little bit longer and answering questions from our participants due to our technical glitch earlier. So I would also like to say thank you to everyone who is on the line still and who joined us and has had to leave. And thank you for your participation, but also for your patience whilst we sorted out that technical glitch earlier on. We do apologise. Sometimes these things happen, but it was fantastic to see that we could keep the chat going whilst we sorted that out. As we've mentioned, the slides will be available, and we will send around an email to everyone who has attended early next week with a copy of the information from today. So keep an eye on your inboxes for that early next week. We will direct you shortly to that quick survey, so if you are able to stay on the line for just a few moments, we would very much value your feedback. But other than that, another thank you to Sarah and Andrew. I have learnt a lot today, and I know everyone else on the line will have as well. So again, thank you so much for being here with us today and presenting our webinar. And without further ado, I wish everyone a very happy Friday afternoon and a wonderful weekend. And to our members, watch this space, and we will send details for our next wonderful webinar very soon. But thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.